Welcome back to Soft Chapters, where every story holds a secret worth waiting for. Settle in, pour something warm, and let this one unfold. The bruise on the baby's arm was shaped like a thumb. Not a fall, not a crib rail, a thumb. The night nurse named Ruth Calloway had worked the private floor of the Halcyon residences for 11 days, and in all that time no one had let her hold the child alone. Tonight they had. Tonight the mother was crying behind a locked door. The father was somewhere below signing papers that smelled of gun oil, and the 6-month-old boy in Ruth's arms had gone quiet in a way that babies do not go quiet unless something is wrong. She turned his sleeve back. She looked at the mark, and she understood that whoever had done this lived in the penthouse. Down the hall, a man who had killed twice before breakfast was about to learn that the woman he'd hired was not who her papers said she was. Rain had been falling on the Upper East Side for 2 days straight, the kind that turns the whole city gray and patient. Ruth Calloway had answered the agency posting because it paid 3 times the going rate and asked no questions, and a woman with her history did not ask questions of an employer who asked none of her. She was 58. Her hands had grown steady over 30 years of night shifts, of feverish children and frightened parents, of the small hours when a person's life narrows down to one struggling breath. She wore sensible shoes and a cardigan the color of oatmeal. Nobody looked at her twice. Nobody ever had. That was, she had learned, the most useful thing a woman could be. The Halcyon was not a hospital. It called itself a residence, but the 11th floor had one apartment, and that apartment had steel doors and men who stood in the stairwells and never sat down. The infant she'd been hired to watch was named Leo. His mother, Adriana, was 26 and beautiful in the hollow way of someone who has not slept in a season. His father Ruth had glimpsed only twice. His father's name was Dominic Vale. She knew that name. Everyone who had lived long enough in this city knew that name, the way you know the name of a storm. For 11 nights nothing had happened. Leo cried, Leo fed, Leo slept. Adriana drifted through the rooms like smoke. And Ruth had begun to think the money was simply the price of silence, of a family that wanted a professional who would see nothing and repeat less. Then came the bruise. She did not gasp. She had trained herself, long ago, out of the habit of gasping. She laid the boy gently in his bassinet, tucked the blanket to his chin, and stood for one heartbeat with her hand flat against her own sternum, counting. Then she did the thing she had promised a dead man she would never do again. She started to pay attention. She listened to the apartment the way she'd once listened to rooms for a living. The hum of the wine refrigerator, the wind against the tall glass. And underneath, from the far study, 2 men's voices, low and clipped, and one of them saying a word she was not meant to hear. The word was Calloway. Her name. Her real one. Ruth went very still. Somewhere in the back of the apartment, a door opened. Footsteps came down the marble hall, unhurried, heavy. A man who had never in his life needed to rush. She had time to lift Leo back into her arms before Dominic Vale filled the doorway of the nursery. He was not tall, which surprised people, but he took up a room the way weather does. Charcoal shirt, sleeves folded to the forearm, a plain steel watch worth more than the building she'd grown up in. His eyes found her, then found the child, then found the pushed-back sleeve she had forgotten to fix. "You saw the mark," he said. It was not a question. Ruth held the baby a fraction closer. "Children bruise." "Not that one." Dominic stepped inside. Behind him, in the hall, a second man appeared, younger, restless, a gun printed clear against his jacket. Dominic did not look at him. "That one has never had a mark on him in his life. I would know. I check him every night when I come home." Something moved across his face, quick and terrible. "So either you're lying to me, Miss Calloway, or someone in my house put their hand on my son." For one heartbeat, nobody moved. Then the younger man in the hall drew his weapon. He didn't point it at Dominic. He pointed it at Ruth. "Boss," the young man said, and his voice was wrong, too tight, too rehearsed. "The agency flagged her tonight. Her file's fake. Ruth Calloway died in Ohio in 2009. This isn't her." The gun did not waver. Leo stirred against Ruth's shoulder and began, softly, to cry. Dominic Vale turned his head slowly toward the younger man, and then back to the woman holding his child, and in his eyes she watched a decade of trust collapse into a single cold calculation. "Well," he said quietly, "that does complicate things." Ruth looked at the gun. She looked at the boy. And she made the choice she had spent 9 years praying she'd never have to make again. "Put that away," she said, "before you frighten the baby." Her voice did not shake. That was what stopped the room. Not the words, but the flatness underneath them, the sound of a woman who had stood in front of guns before and found them less frightening than the men who forgot they were pointing one at an infant. The young man's finger tightened. "Boss. Marcus." Dominic hadn't raised his voice, but the single name landed like a dropped stone. "You will not fire a weapon 3 feet from my son. She's a plant. Romano sent her. She's been in your house 11 days. I know how long she's been in my house." Dominic took the crying child from Ruth's arms with a gentleness that did not match anything else about him. And the moment the boy was clear, he stepped his own body between the gun and the nurse. "What I don't know is why my most careful man is so eager to shoot the one person who found the mark on my son. Lower it." The gun lowered. Slowly. And in that slowness Ruth read everything she needed to know. "He's the one," she said. The room went cold. "Excuse me." Dominic did not turn. The bruise. Ruth kept her eyes on Marcus, on the sweat at his hairline, on the way his weight had shifted to the balls of his feet. "It's a right thumb, pressed from above and to the left." Whoever made it held the baby in their left arm and gripped with the right hand while reaching for something. Reaching or taking. She let that sit. "Your man is right-handed. And he flinched just now when I said I'd found it." "You're insane," Marcus said, but his voice had gone up half a step, and everyone in the room heard it. Dominic Vale looked at his infant son. He looked at the sweating man with the gun. And when he spoke, his voice had dropped so low it barely carried. "Adriana doesn't lock her door," he said, almost to himself. "She's never locked her door in her life. Unless something in this house frightened her." He lifted his eyes. "What did you do, Marcus?" And that was when Marcus stopped pretending. The gun came up fast. But Ruth Calloway had been watching his feet for a full minute, and a woman who watches feet knows a lunge before it begins. She did not scream. She stepped in. She closed the distance while the barrel was still swinging toward Dominic, brought the heel of her palm up under the wrist in a short, brutal arc that snapped the aim toward the ceiling and twisted. The shot went into the plaster. Then her other hand found the pressure point below his ear, the one they'd taught her in a life she'd buried, and Marcus folded like a coat slipping off a hook. The gun was in her hand. She had cleared it, checked it, and lowered it before it fully registered to anyone in the room that the 58-year-old night nurse had disarmed a made man in under 2 seconds. Silence. Dominic Vale stood with his son against his chest and stared at her as though the walls had spoken. "Who are you?" he said. Ruth Calloway exhaled, long and slow, and lowered herself to check that Marcus was still breathing. He was. She'd meant him to be. "My name isn't Calloway," she said. "You already know that." She rose. "It was Delaney. Sister Ruth Delaney, before I left the order. And before that." She looked down at her own steady hands, at the gun she'd set on the changing table. "Before that I worked for the Bureau. 9 years I've been out. I took vows precisely so I would never have to do what I just did." "Then why?" Dominic said. And there was something raw underneath the danger now. "Are you in my house?" "Because 6 weeks ago a woman came to the convent where I keep the books and cry when no one's watching. A young woman, terrified, 26 years old, with a bruise she wouldn't explain and a baby she was afraid to bring home." Ruth met his eyes without flinching. "Adriana didn't hire a nurse, Mr. Vale. She smuggled one in. She wrote to the only person she trusted from a life before you, a nun who used to be something else, because she believed someone inside these walls meant to take her son, and she couldn't tell you, because she didn't know which of your men she could trust." Dominic Vale went absolutely still. "She was right not to," Ruth said softly, and nodded toward the unconscious man on the floor. "Wasn't she?" For a long moment, the only sound was the baby's diminishing hiccups against his father's chest and the rain against the glass. Then, from the doorway, a small voice. Adriana stood there in the hall, one hand on the frame, her face wet, watching her husband hold their son. "I couldn't tell you, Dom," she whispered. "You'd have torn the whole family apart looking for who, and it would have gotten Leo killed in the crossfire. I needed someone who could see it clean, someone nobody would ever look at twice." Dominic Vale looked at his wife. He looked at the child. He looked at the plain gray woman who had been invisible in his home for 11 days and had, in that time, seen the one thing every armed man he owned had missed. Marcus, he said finally, took money to hand my son to the Romano family. As leverage. The words came out flat, but his hands had begun, very slightly, to tremble. They'd have used a 6-month-old boy as a bargaining chip in a war. He'd have taken him tonight, Ruth said. The mark was 3 days old. He was rehearsing, learning how to carry him quietly. She paused. You came home early. That's the only reason he ran the fake file story instead. He was improvising. Dominic crossed the room. He handed the baby, gently, to Adriana, and he watched his wife close her arms around their son and finally breathe. Then he turned to the woman who used to be a nun, who used to be something harder than a nun. I owe you a debt, he said, that I don't know how to name. You don't owe me anything. Ruth picked up her oatmeal-colored cardigan from the back of the chair and folded it over her arm, an ordinary woman in an ordinary sweater, as though the last 3 minutes had happened to someone else. I did what I came to do. Your son is safe. I'll go back to my ledgers and my chapel, and you'll never see me again. And Marcus? Ruth looked down at the man on the floor. Something crossed her face, not cruelty, but the old, tired knowledge of what men like Dominic Vale did with men like Marcus. That's not mine to decide, she said. But if you want my counsel, and I suspect you don't, she met his eyes. A man who sells a child once can be made to tell you every name he sold to. Alive, he's worth more than dead. I'd have thought you knew that better than I do. The smallest thing happened at the corner of Dominic Vale's mouth. Not a smile. The memory of where one might go. Sister, he said, I have employed careful men my entire life. I have never in that life watched anyone do what you just did. He inclined his head, and from a man who bowed to no one, it was an astonishing thing. The Romano family made a mistake tonight. They thought reaching for my son would frighten me into silence. He looked at his wife. He looked at his boy. He looked at the plain, invisible, extraordinary woman by the door. They were about to learn otherwise. Ruth Calloway did leave that night, out through the steel doors and down into the gray rain, an old woman in a cardigan whom the men in the stairwell did not even glance at as she passed. By morning the halcyon residences would have new locks, new men, and one fewer traitor. By nightfall the name Vale would move through the city like the storm it was, and the Romanos would spend the coming weeks learning exactly what they had woken. But the woman who woke it was already gone, back to her ledgers, her chapel, her vows, carrying the one truth she had learned across 2 lives and 30 years of night shifts. The person nobody looks at twice is the person who sees everything. Thank you for spending this time with us here at Soft Chapters. If Ruth's quiet courage moved you, tell us in the comments who you'd want watching over the people you love. Tap like, share your idea for the next story, and subscribe with the bell on, so the next chapter finds you the moment it opens.